Welcome to the tutorial, Pencil Line Textures and the Color Override Effect. So we already know from the previous tutorials that pencil lines can be drawn with textures, but can also be painted with a textured swatch. So with the Color Override module, you can override either the pencil's line texture or the texture fill. And you can do this in order to replace it with another texture, or as we'll see in this video, to animate the texture's position. So to begin, let's draw a circle. So I say pencil line, but any of these central vector drawing tools can also be used. And I'm going to keep it to uniform pencil style, but I'm going to change the width to something really big like 200. And I'm going to select a different texture, bumpy, thin, soft. So if I hold down the Shift key along with the Alt key, I can draw a circle in proportion from the center of where I started dragging my mouse. And then if I go back to the Select tool, I can select my circle. I go to the color palette. I'm going to fill it again with this leopard green fur. In fact, I still think it's not really wide enough. So I'm going to change this to 200 here. There we go. And what I'm also going to do is add a color card, because most of this will take place in the render mode, so without the color card, the background is black. Okay, so now let's go to the network view. And the first thing we're going to take a look at is the actual texture fill, so this leopard print green that we see in the circle. So I'm going to navigate to the module library, and from the library I'm in my favorites tab, and so I happen to have the two things that I need, and that's the color override effect, which I'm going to drag and drop in the network view, and a peg. Okay, so now let's zoom in a little bit. So we're going to take our color override effect, hold down the Alt key, and drag it between the line texture ring. Sorry, that's a layer that I had previously created in the timeline, which is connected directly to the composite. And then we're going to take the peg and hook it to the green port, so this middle port of the color override effect. And the reason that we need a peg is because any of the movements that we'd like to make, we'd like to animate over time, and we can do this on the peg. So now let's click on the yellow box of the color override module, which will bring up its layer properties. It's a pretty different set of layer properties than most other effects. And from our colors section, we're going to take our green leopard fur fill, so this happens to be a bitmap texture fill, and drag it into the color overrides section. Then what we're going to do is change our mode, and we do this by clicking on this button here, the select override mode. And from this we can select one of two things. We can select modulate pencil textures color, so replace transformation, or modulate pencil textures color, combine transformation. So it's up to you, and I'll show you there's a little bit of a difference. Obviously, to replace means that this texture, which we're about to load in right here, will replace the one that we see in the camera view. The other one will combine its matrix with any modifications that we've made using the Edit Gradient Texture tool. So let me just say yes to this for a minute to show you what happens. So right now this has turned black in the render mode. If we go back to the OpenGL view, it still looks leopard print. But the render mode is where we see the override actually occurring, and that's because if you noticed, there's a black swatch in the color override layer properties, and we hadn't changed it. So right now that's the color that's overriding our texture color, so the green leopard print. So let's go back into the color overrides layer properties, and then to get rid of this color, we actually don't want to change the color. What we want to do is replace our green leopard fur with the green leopard fur. We want to use the same texture fill in this case. So we just have to click here, and we automatically get a dialog box that'll let us import in textures, and I'm going to select the green leopard again. So if you remember, it looks like that, and select open. And I make sure to select the correct mode as well. So like I said, you can right click here, or you can click on this button, and then we close. you can see that now that black has been replaced once again with a leopard print fill. And that's for both the render view and the OpenGL. So now the peg comes into play. And to animate the texture fill here on the peg, what we need to do is use the advanced animation tools. So let's bring up that toolbar by going to Windows, Toolbars, Advanced Animation. So the three tools that we would primarily use are these first three here, which is translate, rotate, or scale. And actually what I'm going to do as well is extend the exposure for the line texture ring. So you can always right click and select extend exposure or use the keyboard shortcut F5. So now what we're going to do is drag the red playhead across back to the first frame. We're going to make sure we're on the animate mode and that our peg is selected. I'm going to choose the rotate tool in this case, and we're still in the render mode. What I'm going to do is add a keyframe to the first frame on the peg, drag the playhead down to say the 10th frame, add another keyframe, and make some type of a transformation. So let's rotate. So we just saw that the texture has rotated within this textured circle. So if we drag the playhead back, we can see that it goes back to the start position, and if we just drag it increments across, we can see it rotating. So if we go back to the OpenGL view mode, and we go to the Edit Gradient Texture tool, and we click on our line here, I think we might have to detach the color override to have this work. So I'm just going to use Alt to unhook it. And there we go. We can actually change the way that the fill is spread out along this circle by grabbing this top handle and pulling it across. So that might be a bit too wide. Still a bit too much. So maybe something like that. So now the pattern that we see in the OpenGL view and the pattern that we see in the render view mode updates. So it's good to know that you can do that, but you should always do that, and I should have mentioned this before you add the color override with the peg. So let me put that back, as well as the peg, and luckily it keeps all your values for you. So now we see that we've run into a little bit of a problem. Our pattern that we see here looks like the pattern that was previously seen before we used the Edit Gradient Texture tool to make the leopard print pattern bigger. So we might want to use the modifications that we made using the Edit Gradient Texture tool that we see in this OpenGL mode, but we want to now use it in the color override. So we can do that by changing the mode. So if we go back to the color override, layer properties, and right now we have modulate pencil texture color replace transformation. So the one that we actually want to use is combine transformation. So now it's going to make a combination of the modifications that we made using the Edit Gradient Texture tool. So I'm going to close that. And as you can see, now it's been updated. It doesn't have that small leopard print, it has this wider leopard print. So if we go back, we see it like this, and here it's been stretched. So it's not going to look identical to what we saw in the OpenGL view because it's combining the two. It's combining what we see in the OpenGL view with what's going on in the color override. But you can play around with those until you get the desired effect that you're looking for. So now we're going to take a look at actually changing and animating the line texture. So this is actually a pretty common effect that's used in animation to have the line look like it's sort of jittery as the character moves, and it's usually done in animations that are hand-drawn, so it looks natural. It doesn't work very well with cutout because the line is static, and in fact it works even less well if you have frame holds because then all of a sudden the line stops moving. The nice thing about using the color override effect with a peg is that even if you have stop hold frames or even if you have a cutout puppet, you can animate the line independently. So what I'm actually going to do is go back to the color override, and I'm going to delete this just because it's going to get confusing to see them both at the same time, and we do that by clicking on this minus sign here. Now I'm going to go into my palettes by clicking on this gray arrow. So we have the rabbit palette, which is all the colors of our karate rabbit from a previous tutorial with those two extra swatches that I made, the color gradient and the leopard fur. But the pen style opacity is actually all of the preset pen textures that you can find in the Select Tools tool properties, the Pencil Editors tool properties, and the Pencil tool properties. So I was telling you before that when you use brush strokes with the brush tool, you're using a bitmap swatch. And as you can see with the pencil line, its swatches for its textured lines are actually vector-based. These are all vector-based swatches. So let's grab the one that we used to make that line texture ring, which was bumpy, thin, soft. So you have to remember what it is. And then drag it into the color override section here. So then the mode that we want to select this time is either change pencil texture transformation or modulate pencil texture matrix. So you can use either. I'll start with the first one and say close. And I might delete these keyframes because I think they're kind of screwing things up a little bit because now we're not animating the same thing. So this time what we want to do is change the actual texture of the line. So once again, we have the peg selected in the network view. We have our animate mode on. We need to use one of these tools up here. So in this case, let's use the scale tool. We want to add a keyframe on our peg. We want to drag the playhead down and add another keyframe and then make some type of a modification. So let's make this bigger, for example, or maybe let's see what it looks like smaller. So whichever, and then as we drag this across, you can see that it changes. So that's pretty cool. So one of the last things I want to show you how to do is to do a plane render. So if we do this, we can actually see this live because dragging the red playhead back and forth in the render view mode doesn't really give you a good sense of how this looks animated. So we're going to say yes to that. So I probably should have shortened the length of the scene, but no matter, we'll play this. So you can see, at least for the first 10 seconds, that you can see the texture that makes up the line going from a wider width to a thinner width. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that it's possible to actually enter random values when you're animating. So obviously that might be a good thing to combine with the animation of this texture to really give it that jittery, shaky feel. So to do this, we have to go into the X sheet. And right now we don't see any of the function columns, we just see this drawing column. So I'm just going to open up this part of the window. And I believe I actually have to click on it in the timeline for you to be able to see it in the X sheet view. So we're going to go into the peg, and as we drag the red playhead across, we see that it's the scaling values, the X and Y, that have been animated. So if we go back to the X sheet, after having clicked on one of the two functions, either the scale X or the scale Y, the column suddenly appears in the X sheet. So if we scroll down, we can see that the values go from 1 to 0.575. So if we right-click in the first cell, we can choose Exposure, Fill Cells Randomly. Then we're given the opportunity to enter in the minimum and maximum value. So we know that our maximum value would actually be 1.0, and that our minimum value would be 0.575. And we're not going to have any holds. We don't want just whole numbers because obviously we're using decimal numbers, and we click apply, and we see that all of a sudden these values have changed. So I'm going to say okay, and then if we go back into the timeline and we select the scale Y, and we go back to the X sheet, we see the same thing. We see that it goes from 1 to 0.521. So we want to randomize these ones as well. So we'll right click, go to Exposure, Fill Cells Randomly, Our maximum is going to stay at 1, but this time our minimum will go to 5 to 1. We'll say apply and we'll close. And now when we do a rendered preview of this, yes, we'd like to re-render, we're going to see the line get jittery very randomly. So it's not going to scale smoothly between the values, but it's going to jump around. And there you go. You can even see it in the preview. It's getting very jittery. And obviously you can play with those values to make it more or less subtle. This line is quite large, but if it's the actual lines of a character and they're quite thin, obviously the effect is quite different. So it's just to make you aware that that effect is available. And so I believe that's it for the tutorial, pencil line textures and the color override effect. And it's also the last video in the Harmony pencil line video tutorial series.